Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Salam, hello, peace to you all. Welcome to Office Hours. This is the 24th edition, if you can believe it. Our near weekly Friday afternoon, early evening conclave where people can drop into the chat. We discuss key issues. Sometimes we have guests. Sometimes you have to suffer with me alone. This is one of those weeks, but there was so much to talk about that I thought we might end up having guests that are the speech makers. Today, we're discussing imperial crusaders at Davos and Munich and the people who gave speeches there. And so we'll have a chance to take a look and a listen at these geopolitical framings that are coming from various world leaders and foreign ministers, secretaries of state, etc., to try and piece together what's happening in this particular historical moment and how to really understand the geopolitics of this time and how it fits into broader historical patterns. So we're going to be taking a look at them from a historical perspective. Each of these people clearly were referring to history, so there's a lot to actually discuss and talk about their use and abuse of history. But before we get into the thick of it, I just want to remind everyone that we are doing a weekly fundraiser during office hours to raise money for the Samir Project. We've done the Ramadan Iftar campaign a couple of times. Both times we've done them. By the next week, they have fulfilled their campaign and then renewed it. They have fulfilled their campaign goal from last week. So I decided, let's choose the Rifat al-Arir camp for that campaign and try to support it. I've put the link already in the comments. You can scroll up. And what I'd like to do is have at least 10 people during the course of this stream join me in supporting it with a donation. It can be as little as $25. Of course, if you can do more, we appreciate it. And I know many of you have already given in previous weeks. We're just trying, we don't expect people to do things they can't do. But I think if we have a modest goal of at least 10 each of these weeks, we can keep up encouragement. You're welcome, of course, anytime to make these donations. But I'd love to have a chance to do it in this live stream for our next 90 minutes together. And I've taken a note of where it is right now in the campaign so we can see some of the progress, hopefully, that we make together in supporting this really worthy program. A camp named for Rifat al-Arir, the assassinated professor of English in Gaza, who has published The Empire Writes Back, an amazing collection. He was really an inspirational figure, both as a scholar, a poet himself, and also as a mentor and teacher to so many in Gaza. We remember him, and in his name, we want to support people who are in desperate situations. So please do go. And if you do manage to make a contribution, please post it in the chat to give encouragement to others. We really appreciate it. Of course, you can also support this channel. And this program, you can become a supporter on Patreon, patreon.com/Adnan Husain, or you can make a contribution via a one-time donation through buymeacoffee.com/Adnan Husain. But really, I'd like the focus to be putting, some effort into the Samir Project's programs. They are Palestinian-led, Palestinian-organized, mutual aid organization that helps support Palestinians to stay, to live, to survive, to resist on their land. So let's support them. And the other thing to say, of course, is that it's Ramadan. So Ramadan Mubarak. This is the first office hours during the month of Ramadan, and that's why we're at this slightly earlier time than our normal 5 p.m. because sunset is about 5:40, and I'll try and make it through without having anything to drink here at the end of the day of fasting. But I certainly didn't want to go into the period where I could and should am supposed to break my fast. So we've moved it a little earlier. Hopefully, it's still convenient for you. Okay, so Imperial Crusaders at Davos and Munich. All of these people who gave speeches, the Carney, I'm really speaking about the Mark Carney, Prime Minister of Canada speech at Davos, about Secretary of State Marco Rubio's speech at the Munich Security Conference, and actually also the Foreign Minister of China, Wang Yi's keynote address. In fact, actually, it didn't get all that much attention, but he gave the keynote address, of course, because China is such an important country, in an important nation. He was invited to give the keynote address, and there was a lot less media coverage about it. But I'd like to look at that as a response, a rejoinder, in a way, to both the Carney and the Rubio speech. And I also want to suggest and argue that the Rubio speech was a very conscious response. It was doing many things, and there were many reasons for Marco Rubio to give this speech, including to try to enhance his own presidential ambitions, to fight for a particular geopolitical vision and foreign policy vision within the MAGA conservative movement, facing challenges with some who are pretending, perhaps we could say, to be America first and, wanting to have a constrained U.S. policy. None of this really means like all that much. To my mind, the global vision is just two sides of the same coin, but we will talk a little bit about I think, really important context of Rubio's speech as a response to the vision that Prime Minister Mark Carney put forward in his much hailed, highly acclaimed speech in Davos. Okay. Each of them made claims about history, particularly more modern post-World War II history, because they all seem to recognize, all three of these figures seem to recognize that we are at an inflection point, a moment of transition where, the conditions of the previous world order are, if not changing or over, are at least challenged. Okay, so they're responding to that realization that we're in a particularly important and significant moment of history, and that is partly why they kept referring back to previous periods and eras. For Carney, very strictly post-World War II era. For Marco Rubio, 500 years of European hegemony on the global stage, the so-called European takeoff era. We'll talk a little bit more about that, but with also a serious focus on the post-war period. In fact, he began his speech talking about the Cuban Missile Crisis, just because we're, it was a good point for him to use to talk about the Cold War era. And then Wang Yi's reference, basically at the very outset of his own speech, much more economical, far less with far fewer rhetorical flourishes, and grounded in like serious substance and policy, was talking about the ship of history and putting it on the right direction, right? So really this idea that history has been moving in a certain direction, and now there's a real need to ensure that it goes on the correct course, right? So that's the sense of historical significance that infuses the claims and the framing of all of these three speeches. Okay, so let's get in and talk a little bit about Mark Carney's speech at the World Economic Forum in Davos. He really surprised a lot of people and received a lot of acclaim for basically making a kind of bold and courageous sounding statement in the context of that previous week or 2 weeks of um, U.S. Rhetoric about and threats on Greenland, on Denmark, raising the possibility that the U.S. would try and take over Greenland through force, through military action of some kind, etc. This is what was in the immediate background when Mark Carney made this speech in Davos. And he basically exposed that there has been a lot of hypocrisy in the world system. And that instead, there was no longer the so-called rules-based international order, that you couldn't really keep appealing to it when it was so evident that it was no longer really in force. And he even admitted in great, in without like a lot of detail and without really taking responsibility for this hypocrisy, but he kind of admitted that people really knew and understood that, of course, the world system wasn't working according to the so-called rules-based order, but nobody wanted to admit it. And here he's characterizing himself as a brave person leading the call that we have to take down the signs in the window shop. And he was referring to Václav Havel's statements about the fall of communism in Czechoslovakia. A terrible analogy, to be honest. We'll get into that perhaps as well a little bit. But the reason why we need this framework is because he was putting forward a kind of alternative, okay? Reimagining, well, in the absence of that old system, what would a country like Canada, that claims to be a middle power, recognize that it's not a superpower, argues that there is an era of great power rivalry that is characterizing this multipolar geopolitical environment. So how to navigate this? And is there a way in which smaller middle powers can figure out some organized response to this era of pursuing national interests without really having to appeal to the international rules-based order? Notably, he didn't say the international system and international law, right? I mean, that's quite telling. And that he didn't argue that we should be adhering to international law. He talked about values and how important they are, but he didn't say, that these values, which have purportedly been enshrined in a system of international law designed in the post-World War II environment to stop genocides, ensure that there would be prosecution of war crimes and crimes against humanity, and that there would be stability and peace in the international system by having mechanisms and organizations and bodies like the UN. In fact, he didn't even really talk that much about the UN, right? And that's something that's very important to recognize, is that the UN is being seen as irrelevant even by a power like, a middle power like Canada. So that's something that we should point out. Okay, so having set the stage, let's take a look at one of these clips from the speech where he talks about kind of the dilemma of the middle powers.
This is not naive multilateralism, nor is it relying on their institutions. It's building coalitions that work, issues by issue, with partners who share enough common ground to act together. In some cases, this will be the vast majority of nations. What it's doing is creating a dense web of connections across trade, investment, culture, on which we can draw for future challenges and opportunities. Argue the middle powers must act together because if we're not at the table, we're on the menu. But I'd also say that great powers can afford for now to go it alone. They have the market size, the military capacity, and the leverage to dictate terms. Middle powers do not. But when we only negotiate bilaterally with a hegemon, we negotiate from weakness. We accept what's offered. We compete with each other to be the most accommodating. This is not sovereignty. It's the performance of sovereignty while accepting subordination. In a world of great power rivalry, the countries in between have a choice: compete with each other for favor, or to combine to create a third path with impact. We shouldn't allow the rise of hard power to blind us to the fact that the power of legitimacy, integrity, and rules will remain strong if we choose to wield them together. Which brings me back to Havel. What does it mean for middle powers to live the truth? Well, first, it means naming reality. Stop invoking rules-based international order as though it still functions as advertised. Call it what it is: a system of intensifying great power rivalry where the most powerful pursue their interests using economic integration as coercion. It means acting consistently, applying the same standards to allies and rivals. When middle powers criticize economic intimidation from one direction but stay silent when it comes from another, we are keeping the sign in the window. It means building what we claim to believe in. Rather than waiting for the old order to be restored, it means creating institutions and agreements that function as described. And it means reducing the leverage that enables coercion. That's building a strong domestic economy. It should be every government's immediate priority. And diversification internationally is not just economic prudence, it's a material foundation for honest foreign policy, because countries earn the right to principled stands by reducing their vulnerability to retaliation.
Okay, so, here's the gray man. This is a total establishment figure, who's been like, the head of the Bank of England and the head of the Bank of Canada. Nobody's ever done that. We are talking about a total creature of the financial establishment. He's trying to be bold here and announce some kind of new direction in geopolitics. I'm not sure why he thinks that. I mean, of course, it annoys us to no end to hear the hypocrisy, of people speaking about rules, international law, values when they apply them, as a tool and a weapon of pursuing Western hegemony, but never apply them to themselves or hold themselves accountable to it. Of course, it's deeply annoying to us. It's obviously just hypocrisy. But I'm not so sure that just calling and saying we are in an era of great power, rivalry, competition, and politics, that somehow this being more honest, changes anything, practically speaking. I'm not sure why he makes such a big deal about it. I think it's more rhetorical, is that he wants to be able to acknowledge that there's deep frustration in the entire world with the Gaza genocide, although he won't, say anything about it, has done really nothing about it, about Canada's complicity, in it. But about like how the United States is acting as a bully in the world system, how they're using their aggressive military and threats, to achieve negotiations, the tariffs as a new kind of weapon of financial, that's parallel to sanctions, but using tariffs often on putative allies, right, as a kind of shakedown operation. And the frustration is out there, and I think he's rhetorically trying to, and is among the first leaders to actually directly discuss this, and is capitalized, I think, in some ways by getting out ahead of the curve by naming and acknowledging it. But truly, going forward, I'm not so sure that naming and understanding in your language great power rivalry is such a huge and important tool, for building this new. I think what he's saying also is in a way is that we, have to really be given some slack. If, before we could be accused of hypocrisy, now he's basically saying, yes, it is an era of pursuing national interest. We're going to have to end up doing that multilaterally. And he's trying to build a different orientation and dress it up as somehow a third way. So, I think the other kind of point is of course, I think he's very concerned, as all Canadians really should be, that this revival of the Monroe Doctrine, and this isn't, and actually going well beyond even what the Monroe Doctrine, kind of argued, this kind of neo-Monrovian doctrine, neo-Trumpian doctrine that builds upon the idea that the Western Hemisphere is the province of the U.S. as the great power that has the authority to govern basically over the states of the Western Hemisphere, to have exclusive and prioritized access to its resources and so forth. Is that this is taking place in the context, really, of these threats on Denmark, on Denmark's hold over Greenland, and really, frankly, also Canada. And we recall, it's something that we've talked about, what happened early on during the Trudeau prime ministership when Trump won the November election that year, is that he started calling Trudeau Governor Trudeau, and belittling Canada and Canada's sovereignty, and talking about maybe there could be some annexing of it. So, that's in the background. That's actually what brought Mark Carney, to power. Revive the fortunes of the Liberals by choosing a new leader, and being able to have that leader talk a little bit tough. But I think what has happened since then, the week before Carney gave this speech at Davos, he concluded a major deal, trade relation with China. And I think, in fact, it's actually very significant. And, we were being told, 6 months before this, 8 months before this, that China, that Canada had, very hostile, as a result of the Huawei executive, this whole kerfuffle on behalf of the United States, that Canada arrested this and held this Huawei executive, and it ended up poisoning relations with China for a period of time, and everybody took this as kind of the baseline kind of condition of Canada's relationship to China. And we were being told that, this deep-seated kind of incompatibilities and hostilities and suspicion of China in the federal bureaucracy. I was told, at this meeting, I heard somebody giving advice to our university that you're gonna, if you want to progress in science, technology, and get federal funding, grants for it, in reshaping your, university's orientation, you're going to have to get China off your campus, because, the security questions of maintaining, control over research, and this idea that China is stealing the research, and technology. I mean, it's absolutely absurd kinds of ideas. But we were being basically told that there's kind of a permanent, problem, where Canada really can never, trust and work with China. We might be able to have some kind of working relationship of some sort, but they can't be a serious ally of Canada, and we shouldn't look to a unique relationship with them. A few months later, with the bullying of Trump, the threats that are being raised, all of a sudden, where can you go? Of course, you can only go. China is the only serious alternative, developmentally, economically, even geopolitically, let's be honest. So now he's done that. And I think, he's trying to kind of buttress this requisite relationship with China into a broader theory for a path going forward where Canada would be less dependent militarily and economically on its relationship with an unpredictable and aggressive United States that indeed has designs in controlling the huge number of resources that Canada has as a resource economy, because that's what it really is: timber, beef, mining, and water. That's what Canada has, and natural and oil. We are a Gulf state, and so Avi Lewis, who's running for the NDP, leadership of the NDP. I don't really support him as much as I would have supported Yves Engler, and others, genuine socialists. This is really a social democratic kind of orientation. It's sort of the Bernie Sanders wing of the party, which is, of course, better than the Thomas Mulcair and Jagmeet Singh wing of the party, which is basically neoliberal to the core, with kind of liberal social policy, and a little bit more concern for things like social programs like pharmacare and universal. Being interested in programs like universal childcare and so on. But nonetheless, I think he pegged it correctly in a recent tweet where he said Carney is a really smart guy who is getting a lot of kudos for recognizing the historical circumstances that we're in, but who wants to turn Canada into petro-oligarchy, a militaristic petro-oligarchy. And if you look at what has just happened last week, is the announcement of this new plan, or maybe it was even earlier this week, a new plan for rebuilding Canada's military and for expanding it, both in terms of naval shipbuilding and Arctic capable destroyers and so on, to be able to protect Canada's interests and claims on the north as this competing settler colony, but also, in other, components, just vast military spending, going from what was already an egregiously large amount of a 2% spending to go to, in just a very quick sequence of years, up to 5% spending, which is crushing for social programs and for the budget. That is what is being announced. And it really suggests that Canada is, using, this is what we're seeing now, is, it seems to me, the response to pursue one's own national interest in an era where some of these military and political alliances seem under threat and questionable in how strong they are, like the NATO alliance, the NORAD integration that Canada has with the United States, that what this is propelling through nationalism is remilitarization and militarism. So instead of gaining the peace dividends and peace benefits of, a better world where you're outside of this kind of aggressive, North Atlantic Treaty Organization alliance, which, if they ended NATO, wonderful. But then put that money into building your society, social programs, do good things for your economy, make the green transition. These are the kinds of things you could be doing. Instead, what's happening is those options and possibilities are being foreclosed by this nationalistic militarism, that we have to protect ourselves from this evident and looming threat. And that is indeed, actually going to spur the war economy. It's also what Trump's goal has been with these European so-called allies, is, of course, for them to spend more on U.S. military manufacturers. And so on. And frankly, I expect Mark Carney to actually support the war on Iran, full, back it 100%, despite a lot of his discussion here about middle powers and about, concerns about abuse within the international system, and how we need to create some kind of mechanism for cooperation that protects us and so forth. I think, he is going to be in favor for one simple reason: that he wants to sell oil. He wants to be the replacement oil, one of the replacement for oil and energy to China. So that deal that he signed to increase trade cooperation and a trading relationship with China is being sold as, oh, we will get BYD cars in Canada. Isn't that great? Unlike the Americans who have this 100% tariff, and you don't find any of these Chinese electric vehicles that are better, that are cheaper, in their market. Canada will get them. And so I think what he's going to do is he's going to greenwash the sale and build that second pipeline. It's a great national project. It helps quiet separatist concerns in the West, in Alberta, to kind of put this national infrastructure, another kind of add to the pipeline going east-west rather than these north-south ones that feed the U.S. market for energy, but to go in a more independent direction, sell that to China, and why not take Iran off the board? Does two things. One, limits supply. So Canada then has a sure market for its disgusting, terrible tar sands, the most filthy, awful, environmentally devastating form of fossil fuels. It has a market for it, and it is profitable because the price of oil goes up. Scarcity in supply, disruption in the Gulf, that benefits Canada. In fact, Canada completely benefited from the US invasion of Iraq in exactly the same way, is that it spiked oil prices and made it high enough that it was profitable to do the processing, the high energy processing, that's required, the expensive processing that's required, to convert the tar sands into crude. And that is only possible when oil is at a certain high level. And when it goes above that threshold, it's possible to make a profit. And so Canada has historically, during the era of Stephen Harper, benefited crucially from the high price of oil that was caused for a period of time, and it would benefit again. And I can see him being completely supportive of an attack on Iran, despite his concern about middle powers being on the menu. Right. Well, he's, I think, going to be quite happy to gobble up the oil profits, and greenwash them with like a few hundred electric cars from China. Okay, now that's how I'm seeing what he's saying. Let's take a kind of quick listen to one other clip from him where he kind of is talking about this particular vision. Well, actually, we've done enough on Carney. My point here is just that he set the stage for articulating an alternative where a country like Canada may reorient and build different alliances and diversify its geopolitical and economic position, its military position, through cooperating with new trade deals, with exclusively new trade deals with China and with Europe. That's kind of his goal, to kind of diversify so that Canada isn't totally dependent for its security, for its markets, and for investment entirely on the United States, but to have a range of options. And so he's articulating this kind of third way that might pose a threat of dividing further Europe from just being in its supine, subordinate position as a lackey of the United States, but into actually some kind of, other option. Okay, but I think I would argue that Marco Rubio's speech last week at the Munich Security Conference is really going to look, when we look back on this era, it's going to be a signal call to an era of recolonization. And I find that it is in many ways a kind of response, to go to Europe and to respond to Mark Carney's articulation of these other possible, alliances and trading relationships, to try and use this language about Western supremacy, Western civilization, to try and bring the Europeans back into some kind of collective project to do the U.S.'s bidding as the leader of the Western, imperialist hegemonic alliance. Let's take a look a little bit at that speech. I've got a few sections that I think were really interesting, and maybe I might also read some of the text, but I'm doing a lot of talking, and you want to hear somebody else's voice and also see a different face. I'm not sure you want to hear Marco Rubio's voice or see his face, but I'm afraid he gave the speech, so we'll have to listen and see how much of it we can actually tolerate. But it's extremely interesting, this use of history in particular that caught my interest and attention. And I think I can bring collectively with you some analysis, about this. So let's take a look. I'm going to go to the beginning here. So I'm going to share screen, and I'm learning how to do these things, folks. Bear with me. I'm going to share screen, move to this speech. I got to put it on stage. There he is. Little Marco looking bigger in this big frame here. And let's go to very early in the speech. What he was talking about initially was, he says, just months before this first Munich conference. So this is a history of the Munich conferences. He referred to the Cuban Missile Crisis, and that World War II was still fresh in our minds, but we were on the cusp of this kind of titanic and potentially apocalyptic struggle that could lead to nuclear annihilation. And so it was like a serious moment. And he argues, of course, that Soviet communism was on the march, and thousands of years of Western civilization hung in the balance. Unbelievable, the kind of rhetoric that he was using, but he says, we managed to prevail, and East and West blocs were united, and what he was characterizing essentially as a kind of divided civilization was made whole. Very interesting, this idea of a divided, civilization, something that you find. And I'll just say this: I think the strongest and the most important inspiration for this speech is the vision of Samuel Huntington in The Clash of Civilizations. Like, it absolutely animates this speech. There may be one difference, I would argue, is that Huntington in his era didn't even contemplate and imagine in a direct and overt way in that famous article, Clash of Civilizations, ? That he published, I think in 92 or 93 in Foreign Affairs magazine, or Foreign Affairs, the journal. He didn't even really contemplate and imagine that you could propose at that time for recolonization of the world. What he was arguing for was a kind of retreat into the cultural and civilizational units that existed, but always below the surface. He was providing a warrant and a justification for things like the global war on terror that would, be launched directly in the early 2000s. So I'm not sure this is even really much of a difference. It's just that the moment the opportunity is there, and Rubio articulated this as a sort of goal. But I would say almost everything you can read back into Samuel Huntington, not only in the Clash of Civilizations article. That's the foreign policy, I guess you could say, the foreign policy orientation and mantra and perspective on history of white supremacy. whereas the domestic policy was articulated in the book that came after, the Clash of Civilizations book that he wrote, which is something like Who We Are, or Who Are We? I forget what it was, but it was basically about the browning of America, and because of immigration and because of low birth rates among the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant population, that was leading to a threat in some sense to the integrity of democratic institutions. And he is talking in just the same kind of ethno-nationalist fascistic language that you will hear the Zionists talking about the demographic problem and about the choice that Israel has to choose whether it wants to be, a Jewish state or a democratic state, right? Where it's like demography requires us that if we want to still be a democracy, that we're going to have to, basically, eradicate or force and expel. We're going to have to dispossess the Palestinians even further, in order, for us to maintain our democracy, because the democracy can only be founded on it being, a Jewish, numerical superiority if it is to remain a Jewish state, right? So it's the same kind of logic that informed what Samuel Huntington was saying in that book that followed after the Clash of Civilizations, was essentially an internal, kind of critique of America, and foregrounding the kind of key question and the key problem of culture, of having an integral culture as a civilization, as a culture, a national culture, and the threat that immigration posed to it, right? So you can see that the whole playbook of the far right in the 2000s, 2010s, still even into the 2020s, is coming straight out of Samuel Huntington. But let's take a listen, to Marco Rubio's opening remarks here.
Communism was on the march. Thousands of years of Western civilization hung in the balance. At that time, victory was far from certain. But we were driven by a common purpose. We were unified not just by what we were fighting against. We were unified by what we were fighting for. And together, Europe and America prevailed. And a continent was rebuilt. Our people prospered. In time, the East and West blocks were reunited. A civilization was once again made whole. That infamous wall that had cleaved this nation into two came down, and with it an evil empire. And the East and West became one again. But the euphoria of this triumph led us to a dangerous delusion that we had entered, quote, the end of history, that every nation would now be a liberal democracy, that the ties formed by trade and by commerce alone would now replace nationhood, that the rules-based global order, an overused term, would now replace the national interest, and that we would now live in a world without borders where everyone became a citizen of the world. This was a foolish idea that ignored both human nature and it ignored the lessons of over 5,000 years of recorded human history. And it has cost us dearly. In this delusion, we embraced a dogmatic vision of free and unfettered trade, even as some nations protected their economies and subsidized their companies to systematically undercut ours, shuttering our plants, resulting in large parts of our societies being deindustrialized.
Do you guys also notice that he's not even very good at reading his speech? I mean, this is meant to be soaring, poetic, strong, fluent. He's actually stumbles so frequently over his words. Like, I don't know if he even bothered rehearsing this speech or if he's not very charismatic. I'm sure that is the case, the latter, that he's not actually very charismatic. And if it wasn't for the massive money behind him, I'm not sure he would be any kind of a figure if he wasn't totally bought and sold. The guy has absolutely no charisma.
shipping millions of working and middle-class jobs overseas, and handing control of our critical supply chains to both adversaries and rivals. We increasingly outsourced our sovereignty to international institutions while many nations invested in massive welfare states at the cost of maintaining the ability to defend themselves. This, even as other countries have invested in the most rapid military buildup in all of human history and have not hesitated to use hard power to pursue their own interests. To appease a climate cult, we have imposed energy policies on ourselves that are impoverishing our people, even as our competitors exploit oil and coal and natural gas and anything else, not just to power their economies, but to use as leverage against our own. And in a pursuit of a world without borders, we opened our doors to an unprecedented wave of mass migration that threatens the cohesion of our societies, the continuity of our culture, and the future of our people. We made these mistakes together. And now together we...
Okay, just, have to break in here. So you see where he's going with this whole anti-immigrant. Somehow we were in this borderless world that encouraged all of these, people to come, and now it's threatening the integrity of our society because we can't manage these different and these incompatible populations who don't have the same sorts of values, etc. This is absolutely straight out of the far right, Huntington. It's clear sort of rationale around this as a key galvanizing, question, and issue. But I don't know how much of him we can take, but I mean, it's very important to pay attention to how he's trying to use this to mobilize the loyalty of the Europeans who, as people might know, by the end of this speech, gave it a standing ovation. Okay, which is really absolute. Not, I guess we shouldn't be surprised, but because there have been so many tensions, you would think that they would give a standing ovation to someone who came to talk about renewing the alliances and that they're going to try and solve the kind of problem of Ukraine, or they're going to none of that was really being promised here. What it was a pretty incredible dog whistle to fascistic to fascism, and they loved it. They absolutely loved it. It's like they want to be asked to be part of this project. It was really that part of it is really quite stunning.
We owe it to our people to face those facts and to move forward to rebuild. Under President Trump, the United States of America will once again take on the task of renewal and restoration, driven by a vision of a future as proud, as sovereign, and as vital as our civilization's past. And while we are prepared, if necessary, to do this alone, it is our preference and it is our hope to do this together with you, our friends here in Europe. For the United States and Europe, we belong together. America was founded 250 years ago, but the roots began here on this continent long before. The men who settled and built the nation of my birth arrived on our shores carrying the memories and the traditions and the Christian faith of their ancestors as a sacred inheritance, an unbreakable link between the old world and the new. We are part of one civilization, Western civilization. We are bound to one another by the deepest bonds that nations could share, forged by centuries of shared history, Christian faith, culture, heritage, language, ancestry, and the sacrifices our forefathers made together for the common civilization to which we have fallen heir. And so this is why we Americans may sometimes come off as a little direct and urgent in our counsel. This is why President Trump demands.
Okay. The other point that I wanted to mention, and here, obviously, very clear that this civilizational concept straight from Huntington. But what was interesting in the previous, slightly earlier, and I neglected to mention also, is this idea that we are victims. And maybe it's even self-inflicted victimization, but it's victimization nonetheless. Like, poor us, all these people have come and swamped our societies, these immigrants. Poor, never mentioning, maybe our economic policies of devastation, our military interventions, in Latin and South America, in the Middle East, have created refugee crises. There's no, like, for somebody who's making appeals to history, there's an incredible amnesia, and it allows for creating the subjectivity of victimhood. We're actually the victims of this. We're not the perpetrators. We're the victims. There's something so important in right-wing kind of mentality, is to turn everything into something that has, persecuted them. They have been the subjects of persecution or of, these processes of history. And now it's time to regain, the dignity of being the actors and the agents and no longer the victims. We're going to throw off, we've shackled ourselves with this, kind of climate crisis by not being confident and believing in our technology and our destiny, that we can have limitless growth and constant advancement, burning up all the fossil fuels. We have ourselves limited. We are constraining ourselves. We need to cast off these shackles. That's one of the things that I think is so important to the right-wing imagination, that he is channeling here in such a direct sort of way. Okay, so there are some other great sections. I mean, great for thinking about how awful this vision is, that I want to move to. The next one was a little bit later in this, and I think it's because it's more of an appeal to history more directly. So let's go check that out. We can move over. Okay. Yes.
The West had been expanding. Its missionaries, its pilgrims, its
Okay,
soldiers.
we got to go back just a couple seconds here.
The West had been expanding. Echo. The United States has embarked upon. It is the path we ask you here in Europe to join us on. It is a path we have walked together before and hope to walk together again. For 5 centuries, before the end of the Second World War, the West had been expanding. Its missionaries, its pilgrims, its soldiers, its explorers pouring out from its shores to cross oceans, settle new continents, build vast empires extending out across the globe. But in 1945, for the first time since the age of Columbus, it was contracting. Europe was in ruins. Half of it lived behind an iron curtain, and the rest looked like it would soon follow. The great Western empires had entered into terminal decline, accelerated by godless communist revolutions and by anti-colonial uprisings that would transform the world and drape the red hammer and sickle across vast swaths of the map in the years to come. Against that backdrop, then as now, many came to believe that the West's age of dominance had come to an end, and that our future was destined to be a faint and feeble echo of our past. But together, our predecessors recognized that decline was a choice, and it was a choice they refused to make.
Decline is a choice. What a statement. This guy understands, absolutely nothing about history. Nobody chooses decline. They make terrible decisions, usually based on false ideological projections of how they want the world to be rather than the way it is. And empires in particular overreach and expose themselves to counter forces by attempting and believing that they can, this arrogance that they can control the world and the destiny of all other peoples. This is something that simply does not understand the aspirations for sovereign liberation, sovereign development. Um, throughout the global south is what led, he can't explain, you know, why were there so many anti-colonial movements that rose up from, say, in Algeria, in Vietnam, uh, that fought their colonizers. This is something that doesn't make sense from the logic of the imperial, crusader. He projects this kind of view and understanding of history that it's normal and natural that the West be this hegemon. And he can't even really understand and probably explain how it is. It wasn't because of the genius of some Christopher Columbus, that discovered a new world and so forth, that the West rose. I mean, he has no materialist conception and also a real misunderstanding of the history of colonialism. So that's what's absent and missing in this language of European expansion. It expanded. It's just so expansive. It's just naturally bigger and likes to grow, right? It's this kind of, amazing sort of euphemism for violent, domination, for war, for, being the kind of societies and cultures that manage to use violence so effectively and with such a lack of restraint, that they manage to dominate for a short period in the grand scheme of human history of this period of 500 years. And I think he's admitting that the decline is happening, that this empire is no longer, capable of dominating the world in the way that it may have thought that it was doing so in the period after in the 90s, the so-called unipolar moment. But in a very short period, its weakness, its limitations, have been exposed, particularly economically, because it itself, and he presents this later. I mean, we're not going to have time to, listen to, his economic analysis. He makes it seem as if it was misguided policy to offshore all of these productive manufacturing capacities and capabilities, as if it's China's fault, as if it's poor choices and decisions being made by policymakers, rather than recognizing and understanding that's the nature of corporate capitalism, that it will overrun, the political controls and constraints wherever and whenever possible in order to pursue profits. That's the nature of capitalism, to increase capital. And if that means offshoring productive capacities, manufacturing factories elsewhere, then that's what the Epstein, elite is going to do. And that's the kind of reality that he's incapable really of seeing. So he can only really understand and imagine the resistance of the global South, the aspirations to free themselves from colonial control, as something related to a nefarious ideology, of communism, which was an enemy for the United States. And there's no agency for the peoples of the global South themselves. But what he doesn't, what he actually does get right in a way is that almost all of those, even if they weren't exactly like Soviet style communism, all of those movements, almost all of them, were inspired by the developmental possibilities through the amazing example of how Russia transformed from a kind of feudal agrarian, empire, land-based agrarian empire, into a modern, powerful, great power nation that managed to increase the wealth and health outcomes and life possibilities of its people in an extremely short period of time. And because so many of these wealthy parts of the world, Asia and parts of Africa, there was so many resources, and people had, particularly if you look at the history of West Asia, South Asia, East Asia, East Asia in particular, China, has been the preeminent economic force, in the history of the world, in the long history over a 3,000 period span, more or less, let's say. You would have to admit and acknowledge from the perspective of global and world history that China was the most advanced and developed and prosperous society in world historical terms as a base, just because of its population, its position, and so forth. And that other parts of the world also had developed, various kinds of capacities that were underdeveloped, de-developed through the violent imposition of colonialism. And the modern kind of European empires, they underdeveloped and de-developed so much of the global South. So of course they looked to the Soviet Union and then later to China as examples and models by which they might hope as well to secure sovereign development and advancements for their people. This is the kind of perspective that's impossible from this imperialist crusader kind of imagination, which fetishizes and romanticizes and whitewashes this period of colonial history as expansion. Europe expanded, and it created these satellite settler colonial societies that managed through genocide to essentially eradicate indigenous populations or subject them through extreme violence to colonial rule, to the extent where new kind of societies were established as kind of offshoots of Europe in North America, in South America, though we might argue that they have a very different kind of history and trajectory, although that's also something to note, that Republican revolutions that took place were by the kind of planter oligarchic class, even in Latin America, at least initially, but also to, Oceania, these kind of Australia and New Zealand. We have to kind of group them all together, I think, meaningfully under Europe and its settler, colonies. In historical terms, this wasn't expansion, this was conquest, this was destruction, this was colonial violence. And so that's, I think, something that's really important to point out and to understand here, is that he is bemoaning the fact that peoples around the world freed themselves. It's interesting, the contrast between the way in which the American century, as it was kind of propounded in like the era of World War II and in the post, colonial world, was, United States was seen as not like old Europe, and it tried to represent and portray itself as a different kind of power that would cooperate, that understood, because it had had this revolution. Of course, that's the biggest kind of myth and propaganda. Of course, let's all refer to Gerald Horne's important work on the counter-revolution of 1776. It was a settler colonial breakaway revolution. It's like Ian Smith in Rhodesia. That's the character of it, is we are concerned that we will not be able to keep our slaves, continue to have wars against and slaughter and genocide the indigenous peoples, and import all of this, kind of, labor from, of people who, have land hunger from, desperate circumstances in Europe, but can be sold the chance and the opportunity to make a new life as settler colonists in the New World, right? Like, this is what they were trying to protect from the interference, from the governance of, and from the taxation required for their own security and so forth by the empire, right? They wanted to have their own sovereignty to continue to pursue governance under the settler colonial regime and all that entailed, right? So, but the United States nonetheless had been able to kind of sell this as a, revolution for freedom and democracy, and that was crucial and necessary when it was competing with the Soviet Union and other communist countries for influence and for markets and for control in the decolonizing a global South after the devastations of World War II, when it was clear the British Empire would not be able to survive in the same way. It had already been weakening, and the war really sort of finished off British capability and capacity to hang on and hold on to its empire. The same happened for France. It had a period where it tried to reassert its colonial control, but resistance by many colonial troops who actually had been part of the liberation of Europe, the liberation of France, then demanded their own rights and, began, those aspirations were, of course, suffocated, and that led to resistance, anti-colonial resistance. So it was during the period where they had to compete with the genuine developmental message of communism and socialism after World War II that we see the United States manufacturing this narrative that we are different from old Europe and that we will help you, we will spread democracy, we will, allow you to have, aspirations, for your own freedom and so on, and tried to propound that they had this kind of a model. We see how that was only skin deep, because look, you scratch the surface, there's no longer, there's no longer a Soviet Union, a rival, that is ideologically aggressive in the world system. And so as a result, he is ready here to pronounce a new colonialist vision for Western civilization to try and repair the fractures that have been occurring, in the sort of so-called Western alliance, and to which Mark Carney is appealing to as, that we might have alternative, forms of multilateralism that would work to constrain the devastating consequences of these unpredictable great powers like the United States. So you can see that Marco Rubio's task here is in some ways to counter the possibilities of a different vision, while at the same time building, consensus around that vision being one based not on a vision of prosperity for the world as a whole, not on a universalist sort of message, but a return to 19th century, well, you could even say, of course, Huntingtonian, but 19th century colonial ideas that have at their root racism, white supremacy. That's what it's founded on. And that's the appeal that he made and is making to the Europeans, and they absolutely loved it. You know what it reminded me of? Of course, many people, have mentioned this took place in Munich, and it, has a lot of resonances with, the launch of the Nazi, project, that had as its base Munich. And people remember those important Munich rallies and so on as being similarly aggressive, propounding this racialist, Western supremacist sort of view. But let's not forget that, Nazism was seen as a very disruptive and destructive force in its age as well, right? Obviously, World War II was fought. Eventually, Western European, well, the United States and Britain, eventually entered, the war. But I think what's kind of interesting here is the analysis that I talked about at a previous office hours from Aimé Césaire, this book, a very slim little essay by Aimé Césaire, the Caribbean anti-colonial and the poet and anti-colonial thinker. This book, Discourse on Colonialism. For patrons, I did a reading of first section or so of this and with some commentary. I think this work is even more important now after the Rubio speech. I mean, it really is an analysis that helps explain and understand what the real crime of fascists are. The real crime of fascists for the rest of the West is that they might use the same techniques of colonial violence, domination, and genocide against other Europeans. That's what he says in this book in the very beginning. He says, you know, the problem for you of Hitlerism was that he did what they've been doing to the black and brown people of the world for hundreds of years. He did it to you, and that couldn't be tolerated. And so what Marco Rubio is offering is, let's do that together again, right? You know, you're afraid that Trump is running riot and bringing this kind of aggressive domination, and he's going to break up NATO. He's going to try and annex and take Greenland and do these sorts of things. And he's, you know, going to kind of, you know, undermine Europe, and that he doesn't care about Europe, etc. This vision is of how to recruit Europe into this alliance, and it was not by propounding, you know, some idea of our values and their universal, you know, characteristics or the prosperity for the world, but in fact, actually, it is a fascistic vision, you know, that he is selling. And the acclamation that it reminded me very much of the launching of the first kind of era of colonization. Not when he says, you know, when it worked or started to work in the Atlantic world with Christopher Columbus and, you know, the development of the Atlantic system, the Atlantic colonies, and all that came with it. But in fact, it was actually, of course, Clermont in 1095. You knew I was going to get to the Crusades eventually, but that's what it reminded me of, is propounding this kind of vision for colonization as a Europe-wide, in that era, Latin Christendom, now Europe and the West, a kind of Western alliance revived on, not on the basis of these universalist sounding democratic principles, but now back on the naked supremacist argument. And it was so important in Rubio's speech that he kept talking about the foundations in Christian culture. In a way, he's calling for a new Christendom, a new set of crusades to inspire, you know, and fire the historical imagination. The problem for them was that the Crusades at the time didn't work because there was resistance. There was anti-colonial resistance. There were powers that were capable of defending themselves. And this kind of settler enclave that was established in the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem managed only to exist for just under 200 years. And the world has changed since then. The pace of history is much faster. There's more resistance, and so we will see, you know, whether, you know, this will survive. You know, this kind of a vision will survive. So it reminded me very much of Urban II's speech announcing the call for the Crusades, and the way in which this speech just fired the imagination and brought the audience together into a spontaneous exhortation and acclamation, that they let out this cry in unison, according to the chronicles that recount the speech. Deus lo vult, God wills it, which becomes the Crusader battle cry. It just kind of spontaneously came out, and everyone started chanting this, you know, to approve this vision of going out to conquer the enemy, the others that need to be subordinate. And I would say that's where we see these foundations really, in his speech. Now, there's so much that he talked about that we could go into. I don't want to belabor the situation. We could listen to more parts. I mean, he says some just absolutely astonishing things, and his use of history is particularly just crude. It's a vision of of a Western supremacist view of history that is so unreal, so fantastical. He even talks about, okay, I just have to give one example from, he talks about the settler, he celebrates the European settler colonists, the variety and diversity, from Germany, from, England, from Ireland and Scotland and so on, and talks about like what they brought, what they did essentially in creating, the US as a byproduct of European culture and civilization. That's what the point that he's making. But one of the things he said is, and the Spanish bringing their, kind of ranching and caballero, culture, astonishing. They have no sense, no understanding of the way in which the Mediterranean world was integrated with so many interconnections and exchanges and cultural transfers, and that so many of the things that he would be arguing were part of Europe's genius were built upon scientific and cultural and intellectual foundations in their neighbors in the Islamicate world, even to the extent that the culture that he's talking about of cowboy transhumans, like managing herds and flocks in the great west of the United States, that it was of course taken over first from the settler, Spanish settler colonists. Yes, that caballero culture, but where did they get it? I mean, the nomads, the nomadic groups, the Berbers and Arabs who established, ranching, in southern Spain, Andalusia, that's something that they learned, that they absorbed, and like so many other things, then have this historical amnesia about the interchange between societies and cultures is what has brought true development, true progress, is people being exposed to good ideas or cultural practices that they're interested in, to knowledge, etc., and that this is a product of collective human endeavor that doesn't just belong to one society or culture alone, but in its relationship with others. And that doesn't mean that each culture doesn't develop its own language and aspects of culture and so on, but that these never happened entirely in isolation in a vacuum tube somewhere, but that history is a product of these encounters and the processes of exchange. And that even something that he was celebrating as so American, and he's trying to, demonstrate this kind of knowledge that, it has roots in Europe, is in fact actually something that, has an even longer and more significant kind of history that's proximate to the Spanish development of this culture and its transplantation and further development into, North America. So in any case, but what I do want to end on is at least feeling some sense of restoration. We've had this vision of the middle powers and a new multilateralism, acknowledging and recognizing that we never really lived up to or implemented the rules-based order, and now we should just be honest about it and pursue our interests. But us middle group need to create some constraints on this era, of great power, competition, and conflict, so that we can survive. That's Carney, right? So, and maybe that means that we might not all just be one, group in with the U.S. We might have to have other forms of alliance and treaties and exchanges and so on, right? So that's one particular kind of vision as an adaptation to this new era. The second, this assertive, in the face of U.S. weakness, let's try and recruit, the Europeans into a project that is a project of colonial racism, and that, appeals to this fantastical kind of projection of history, while not talking at all about any of the material conditions under which this has been pursued, the nature of capitalism, colonial violence, but to celebrate this as an achievement of Western culture as a basis for Europe being reintegrated in some collective project with the US. And then what do we have in response to this? I thought the keynote speech that was given by Wang at the Munich conference was really a response to the Rubio and the Carney speeches, and it was a call to reinvest in a better and fairer way, pointing out the problem was not. I think one of the statements that he made is the problem and the failure has not been of the UN itself, like, as if the UN is just so flawed, but the fact that we have not allowed the UN to be a democratic, properly functioning, organization that really reflects the global will and makes space for other smaller middle. This was a response in some ways to that idea about the middle powers, was the idea that if you democratized the UN and improved it, then it would be a place where diplomacy, could take place, where the rights of smaller and middle kind of nations could be protected, right? And this is the strongest nation in the world at this moment saying we should invest in democratizing the UN. Okay, so it's a total contrast in many ways. But let's take a little listen to a couple of segments of this speech, which was, as I said, the keynote speech at the Munich conference.
Over the past year, the international landscape was marked by growing transformation and turbulence, and the law of the jungle and unilateralism went rampant. Humanity has come to a new crossroads for the cause of peace and development. At such a juncture, President Xi Jinping has put forward the Global Governance Initiative, or GGI, and called for following the 5 principles of sovereign equality, international rule of law, multilateralism, the people-centered approach, and real actions, with a view to jointly building a more just and equitable global governance system. This initiative aligns with the progressive trend of the times, represents the biggest common ground of the world's nations, and has thus received widespread response from the international community shortly after its announcement. It injects new impetus into the endeavor to build the community with a shared future for humanity, and offers a compass for the giant ship of history to navigate through storms toward a brighter future. Know that humanity has weathered wind and rain to come this far. Pulling together should be the imperative choice. We should reform and improve global governance to set the ship of history on the right course.
So, you can read, because we won't have time to really go into as much detail with this speech. You can read it on, in fact, let me put the link in the chat. You can read an English transcript of it, on the Chinese government website, foreign ministry website. But the important point about it is, one observation I would make is, firstly, very calm, elegant figure, brief. Okay, I could take a lesson from him. He encapsulated so much in a very direct, brief, economical, and sensible sort of way. Okay. Actually, I need to stop sharing the Rubio because we are no longer trapped in Marco Rubio's world. Let's hope that we can get out from the one he's trying to build and create. But what we have, is a real respect for and a different way of narrating the consequences of post-World War II history. So he also goes back to the immediate post-World War II history and says, the founding of the UN was an important outcome of the victory of the World Anti-Fascist War. There's the direct contrast right away. It was a world alliance against fascism, whether it was fascism in the Far East under the Imperial Japan, or whether it was in Europe and the Mediterranean world in West Asia. That's where the war was fought in Europe, but also in North Africa and so on, against the other two Axis powers. Fascist Italy and Nazi Germany, and that a historic choice made by previous generations after painful reflection on past agonies, that's why the UN was founded, in the victory of the World Anti-Fascist War and making a historic choice, reflecting on the painful reflection on past agonies and the peace endeavor that nations have invested their greatest efforts in thus far. This edifice was jointly built by the people of the world. Okay, so, in Marco Rubio's kind of conception of it, it's all a U.S. Kind of, construct, and it's no longer serving its purpose. We have every responsibility to reinforce and renovate it, and no right to destroy it or tear it down. And he further goes on to point out that the UN Charter, is the document, and its principles is the document that has the greatest legitimacy in the world. It is the document that is approved of by nations, peoples across the world. It's like the single most kind of important statement of collective values for peace, prosperity, and, the rights of all. And so his point is, instead of saying, oh, it's all over, and, we need to kind of figure out a new multilateral set of arrangements, or it's all over and good riddance because we want to recolonize the rest of the world, join us in our fascistic, plan for racial, colonial, kind of religious violence against the rest of the world to dominate it. And to kind of turn back decline, acknowledging that they are in a decline. Instead, he's saying we need to invest in building an effective international system, and we could do that if we built on the principles of the UN, but actually tried to implement them and tried to make it more democratic. And he points out, that the UN is not perfect, but it remains the most universal and authoritative intergovernmental organization in the world. On the UN platform, each country, regardless of its size or wealth, has a voice and a sacred vote, as well as its due obligations and equal rights. Without the UN, the world would revert to the law of the jungle, where the strong prey on the weak, and many small and medium-sized countries would lose the multilateral foundation critical to their survival and development. So he's responding there to Law of Jungle, Marco Rubio, and as a representative of the U.S.'s behavior in shredding U.S. and its support for, genocidal state of Israel's shredding of the international legal order, international human rights law, etc. And also this supposed kind of orientation to just have a kind of small, medium-sized countries respond to this era of great power. Conflict. He's arguing for the possibility that we could still have, a revived UN. And he points out, very clearly, as he says, a review of history shows, from the victory of the World Anti-Fascist War to overcoming the global financial crisis, from the climate response to fighting terrorism, none of such progress would have been possible without countries coming together for sincere cooperation despite their differences. Right? So he's holding out the possibility that if there's genuine leadership and democratizing of the world system, then, this may be, possible. And he points out that we need to make sure all countries abide by the same set of rules, i.e. the basic norms governing international relations underpinned by the purposes and the principles of the UN Charter. And that in that, particularly small and medium-sized ones should be able to find their places and play their roles in international relations. and he blames very clearly that, the problem is that there have been powerful nations in the past who have, abused their position, have, made a mess of this international system. He talks about, particular situations. He even references Gaza, mentions the realization of ceasefire and reconstruction require unremitting efforts to implement the two-state solution and restore fairness and justice to the Palestinian people is the unshirkable responsibility of the international community. We may say, oh, the two-state solution is not a, possibility, and we don't even think it's as good an idea as, having one state equal and democratic for all the peoples of the territory. But, in the international system, for China to continue to talk about Gaza when everybody else ignores it seemed to me, again, practical, direct. There are real world problems, conflicts. He points out there's 60, conflicts going on around the world, and that if we want a better world and we want prosperity, we need to actually invest in an international system that can use diplomacy to promote peace and to resolve these differences and negotiate, to respect, differences of culture and differences, of system and so on, but still find, the common ground that, should exist and does exist. So, I think we could listen to one more, clip and really enjoy a reasonable, sensible statesman commenting on world affairs and responding to a limited vision that really doesn't address the key problems in Carney, and an absolutely insane, regressive, fascistic vision that's so dangerous for the world on the other. By listening to this second clip.
In reforming and improving global governance, the priority is to revitalize the UN system. The founding of the UN is an important outcome of the victory of the World Anti-Fascist War. It is a historic choice made by previous generations after painful reflection on past agonies, and it is the peace endeavor that nations have invested their greatest efforts in thus far. This edifice was jointly built by the people of the world, who have every responsibility to reinforce and renovate it and no right to destroy it or tear it down. The UN is not perfect in its current form, but it remains the most universal and authoritative international and intergovernmental organization in the world. On the UN platform, every country, regardless of its size or wealth, has a voice and a sacred vote, as well as its due obligations and equal rights. Without the UN, the world would revert to the law of the jungle, where the strong prey on the weak, and many medium and small-sized countries would lose the multilateral foundation critical to their survival and development. So what is imperative for us today is to recommit to the founding mission of the UN, revitalize its leading role, abide by the purposes of the UN Charter, and enhance the efficiency and efficacy of the UN system, so that the organization will be able to better adapt to the needs of the 21st century and unleash renewed vitality. In reforming and improving global governance, the key lies in the collaboration and cooperation of all countries. The reason why the international system is not functioning well enough lies not with the UN itself, but rather with certain countries seeking to magnify differences and disagreements, put itself above everyone else, stoke bloc confrontation, and even revive the Cold War mentality. So all these have eroded the foundation of trust, worsened the atmosphere for cooperation, and impeded the functioning of international institutions.
Okay, a sane statesman. It's very refreshing. I wish there had been a lot more coverage about his important intervention, a counter vision for the world to respond and to resist to this insistence on dismantling an international system that, were to be democratic and democratized, could be a mechanism for resolving some of the imperialist wars. That's the real danger that we're dealing with here, is, of course, the imperialist wars. We're right now on the cusp. I haven't been watching the news to see if something might have happened, but this weekend is being marked as a very likely opportunity for U.S. aggression and beginning of, open war on Iran because of the arrival of the third aircraft carrier group into the region, two in the Indian Ocean and in the vicinity of the Gulf, the Abraham Lincoln and the Gerald Ford, and even before into the Mediterranean, into the Eastern Mediterranean, the George Bush, I can't remember if it's H.W. or George W. Bush carrier group that is clearly there to be a kind of shield for, parts of West Asia. Let's just put it, at that, in defense against Iran's missile capabilities. The fact that they're all positioned, and apparently the Gerald Ford arrives, from what I've heard, following some of the military junkies working with open source and OSINT kind of tracking and all that it's scheduled basically to arrive Saturday into the region. And so then there will be the biggest array of U.S. military deployments, troops, and naval and Air Force resources and assets in the region since the Iraq invasion. And so it will seem, many people think, to be the opportune moment to unleash the U.S. way of war. And we're on the cusp of this, and there's been so little discussion of this publicly. There was some talk that there might be a resolution to require in Congress to require the administration to seek approval of Congress, or some kind of way of informing and having congressional authority. Next week, there's some talk of this being introduced, and that makes it perhaps even more likely that it would be this weekend to have a fait accompli to start the war, and then be able to characterize it as a matter of having to defend U.S. Service people and bases and so on from counterattack that is expected, to happen. Meanwhile, negotiations are continuing. But what is the basis of these negotiations when they've been undermined, vetoed, and subverted, or used as a ruse to pursue military attack upon Iran? This is the world that we're inhabiting. And to see that there's been so little discussion of this in the media, other than the inevitability of something having to happen, but not contesting or questioning the basis of it, the illegality of it, the devastation that the world will have to go through. This is the fact that there's nobody on the streets when there are protests. There are protests, by the extreme right-wing, diaspora, Iranian diaspora, and they're, carrying Israeli flags, and coming into the thousands in Toronto, for example. This is really deeply concerning to see that there's been so little. And this, you can understand, protests have not done what they, what we imagined or hoped that they might do if there was really democracy. The people protesting in the streets should actually be a major technique for applying political pressure. But with this oligarchic Epstein class that seems so insulated and immune because it has suborned and controlled, our government, and insulated itself from having its interest ever be subject to being countered, being resisted, is that, obviously protests then don't seem to make a huge amount of difference. So people are tired of going into the streets with no effect, even though, Venezuela's, duly elected leader has been kidnapped. Cuba is suffering a Gaza-like blockade. on top of the decades upon decades upon decades of sanctions. It has, been the most sanctioned, country in the world, and now with this looming, impending, and I think potentially devastating war, upon Iran, the fact that we are so pacified and see no avenues for actual resistance is really quite a statement of the situation that we're in. These imperialist wars are the greatest danger to the world, and the Chinese foreign minister articulated a program and a plan for peace, governance, these principles of governance, and a reviving of the institutions and rebuilding them on a more democratic basis to be more inclusive, and not as a tool for governing and controlling the world, which is in many ways the way in which these international institutions, everything from the UN to the World Bank, have been used by Western empire. If that goes, that's fine. But what we still need are, some kind of system that can allow for genuine multilateralism and internationalism that respects the sovereignty of countries, small and large, north and south. And there was a question here by Patmos Revelator. Would I support the end of veto power in the UN? Absolutely. That is one kind of major problem, is that the veto of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council is a major obstacle to democratizing the institution and having it actually function and serve the needs of the world as a whole, and not just the victorious powers of, World War II. That is a long time ago, and there needs to be, a different system. Well, there's so much that we could talk about. I want to ask you to like the stream again, to make a donation, like the stream, subscribe, share it on social media. You can also support the the channel, of course, but I would really much prefer, in the closing minutes that we have, if people would go over and make a donation. I'm going to do that now. I've been busy kind of talking. I should have done it during one of the longer clips, but I'm going to go and make a donation to the Samir Project's campaign for the Rifat al-Arir camp in Gaza. This mutual aid organization run by and established by Palestinians is so important for providing collective solutions, collective response to Palestinians, on behalf of Palestinians, to help them maintain their existence and resistance, on their land in Gaza. So please join me in making a donation if you can. I've seen that there have been a lot of great comments. I've been able to kind of put up at least a few, over the course of this stream. And I just want to thank everybody for being here, for joining me in these important, I hope you find these important and valuable conversations about the state of the world, in this case, using these speeches as historical documents that are reflective of the kind of geopolitical thinking and the use of history in our particular moment. We are in an important historical moment, and so there are going to be contestations about both the past in order to pattern what they want in the future, and we have contending and different visions of the future. Our vision is of international peace, prosperity, sustainability, and solidarity for the peoples of the world. And what we see, principally on the other side, is a perpetuation of the same conditions of exploitation, of colonial and racial violence, of capitalist exploitation, and the enrichment of the few over the many. Let's turn this around, people. I want the vision that Foreign Minister Wang Yi put forward at the Munich conference. All the rest seems to me imperial crusading, and we have to resist that. So thank you again for joining me. Peace with justice, to you all, and solidarity. And thank you for the Ramadan iftar wishes. I'm going to go break my fast. It's now time. Thank you again, everyone.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim.